In many cases, you find situations like this where families break up.
I didn't know how we would make it through it.
I think it was premeditated.
I knew something awful had happened.
A beautiful college student is found dead in her dorm room. But when the police can't figure out what happened, a devastated father sets out to find the answers himself.
Children just aren't supposed to die before the parents. My position is very simple. I want the man dead.
Then, a loving wife and mother vanishes without a trace. Did she run away from her seemingly perfect life? Or was something far more sinister at work?
No matter how long it takes, we're gonna find her. And that's just the way it was.
What happened? It's hard to believe. I know in my heart. Shot.
We had to find some answers.
Let it go unsolved.
Reopen
Figure out who did that.
the investigation.
I needed justice.
The crucial information.
Never gonna give
I
up.
had to do everything I could.
April 8th, 1982. It's Friday night in the small college town of Carbondale, Illinois.
It was about 3 or 4 weeks before graduation.
A young woman steps out of the shower. She's a senior nearing the end of her last semester. Little does anyone know, she won't live to see her diploma.
The body was on the floor of her bedroom.
300 miles away, in a quiet Chicago suburb, a knock on the front door at 3 a.m. startles Bernie and Hazel Shepherd awake. It's the police.
One guy said, there's been some trouble in Carbondale. I've got a daughter in Carbondale. He said, Deborah's dead. And I said, no, that can't be. And he nodded his head. And then question comes into your mind, why?
Just 23 years old, Debra Shepherd was Bernie and Hazel's eldest daughter. They can barely comprehend the news.
A child's death is probably the most devastating thing that can happen to a family.
I never had an experience like that. It was very hard, all I can say.
Bernie is desperate for an explanation. And within hours, he's on the road to Carbondale. At 2 p.m., he walks into the police department, demanding to know what happened to his daughter. Officer Paul Eccles walks him through what they know so far.
The detectives that arrived that night found Deborah's apartment door ajar. There was a note on the door that said, "Knock loud, I'm in the shower," and it was signed by Deborah.
Investigators on the scene also notice that one of the ground floor windows is slightly open.
The crime scene technicians who examined the scene had believed that no one came through that window. Deborah's body was on the floor. There was a maroon-colored shirt that was laying on the floor between her body and the bed. We weren't really sure exactly what the cause of death might have been.
Bernie is disturbed by the facts of the case and left with a host of questions. Who was the note on the door for? And why was the window left open? And most importantly, how did his daughter die? Determined to get some answers, Bernie heads directly to the coroner's office.
The first autopsy was done the morning after Deborah's body was found.
On first blush, the local pathologist suspects Deborah may have died from a drug overdose, as she's exhibiting a telltale sign.
There was somewhat of a bloody froth that had come from her mouth.
And when the police find empty pill bottles in her apartment, it seems to confirm the suspicion.
Deborah didn't smoke, didn't drink, and use no drugs.
Bernie would not accept the fact that she might have died of drug overdose.
In a state of disbelief, Bernie is compelled to get a second opinion. His next call is to a well-connected family friend who immediately puts him in touch with Dr. Robert Stein.
Stein at the time was the Cook County coroner, and he probably was the most eminent pathologist in the country. Dr. Stein said, yeah, bring the body here.
2 days later, Deborah's remains are flown to Chicago, where Dr. Stein begins a meticulous examination. At first, he's perplexed by what he sees. There are no obvious signs of trauma to the head or torso. But as he nears the end of the autopsy, Dr. Stein makes an alarming discovery.
Dr. Stein found that there were some damage in the tissues of her neck.
And the damage to Deborah's neck is not at all consistent with a fall or any other type of accidental injury.
He called me and said, Bernie, Deborah was killed. It was a homicide. She was strangled.
But that's not all. Dr. Stein goes on to tell the Shepherds something no parent is ever prepared to hear. He's uncovered another disturbing detail during the autopsy: a sperm sample from Deborah's mouth. This finding strongly suggests that their daughter was also sexually assaulted.
It was awful. It was a nightmare to hear how she must have suffered.
The Shepherds are overwhelmed by the news. It's inconceivable that something so horrible could have happened to a girl who, for her entire life, seemed to have the world at her feet.
When Deborah was born, I was 23 years old. I just couldn't ask for a better child. Everybody loved Deborah.
Deborah wanted to be a veterinarian. That was her goal.
And when it came time to select a college, Deborah chose a well-respected school in Carbondale, Illinois, with a strong pre-vet program.
I was happy she was going away because she wanted to. She selected the school. My husband objected. He did not want her to go.
I wasn't very strict. I was protective.
My husband just worshiped Deborah. They had a beautiful relationship.
But now, all Bernie and Hazel have are memories. And a chore that no parent should ever be faced with: planning their child's burial.
You know, that day was a very bad time for me. I didn't know how I was gonna make it through it.
But the Shepherds have to keep their feelings at bay. Their single-minded purpose now is to help police catch the man who took their daughter's life. And with Dr. Stein's new autopsy report in hand, they suddenly have a lot more to go on.
We knew that there was evidence that there had been oral sex, but it was very limited in the amount of DNA material.
Police don't yet have the technology to adequately obtain a DNA profile from the sample found on the body. But they do think they know who the semen belongs to: Deborah's boyfriend, Joe Brown.
Because of the fact that he found her, and he's the one that reported her death, and he was by himself when he found her body.
Detectives immediately bring Brown in for questioning, and they insist that he take a polygraph test.
There was a series of questions. Did you kill Debra Shepherd? Do you know who killed Debra Shepherd? Were you there when Debra Shepherd was murdered? Did you ever have sex with Debra Shepherd?
On April 8, 1982, 23-year-old Debra Shepherd was found dead in her apartment, only weeks away from graduation. Her father, Bernie, determined to learn the truth, has been driving the case forward. Now the police have a suspect, Joe Brown, Deborah's boyfriend, who's been asked to take a polygraph test.
His alibi was checked, and he was examined closely.
But Joe Brown passes the test, and with no evidence linking him to Deborah's death, the Carbondale police have to let him go. Back at square one, Bernie pushes the police to carefully re-examine the crime scene.
Since there was a note on the door, they speculated that someone might have been planning to stop in.
Armed with scant evidence, the police put together a profile of who they believe may have committed the crime.
They were primarily looking for a young black male, possibly a student, that was around Deborah's age that she knew and had some relationship with.
Police immediately begin questioning Deborah's friends and teachers. 300 miles away, the Shepherd family is calling the precinct regularly for updates. But the little information investigators are sharing isn't enough for Bernie.
I was told very little about what they were doing. They told me they had interested parties.
As the weeks go by, his frustration continues to build. And it isn't long before Bernie decides to head back to Carbondale.
Oh, my husband started investigating the next day.
Mr. Shepherd had, in those early days, came to Carbondale trying to find the killer on his own.
Well, I started my investigation by talking to all the people that I could find out that had any knowledge of Deborah or her associates.
And just 2 days into his very personal crusade, Bernie uncovers a startling new lead. 3 men who seem to fit the cop's profile to a T.
They were there to be around the students in Carbondale or to hit on girls that were living in Carbondale.
Intrigued, Bernie takes a bold and potentially dangerous step.
I went into their apartment, and it was late at night. I talked to them. I was very interested in finding out if they had anything to do with Deborah's death.
He pushes them hard for nearly an hour, but all 3 deny any involvement. Unconvinced, Bernie takes his suspicions directly to the police.
Detectives did go out and interview these people who Mr. Shepherd suggested that might have more information.
Well, the police department then subsequently investigated them as well. They came back to say, well, Mr. Shepherd, we've talked to them extensively, and there's no involvement there whatsoever.
Still, Bernie is sure he's on the right track and that the man who killed Deborah is someone who knew her. One by one, he interviews his daughter's friends, hoping that somebody will remember something. Then, 5 weeks after he first arrived in Carbondale, Bernie gets a solid tip. It seems that in the months before her death, one of Deborah's classmates had become infatuated with the attractive senior.
I spoke to him immediately after this happened, and I met him on 2 occasions. He liked Deborah. He admitted that to me, but she just dismissed him.
His name is Derek Jones, and Bernie is sure that he had something to do with Deborah's death. Now, he just has to convince the police.
I subsequently contacted some members of the police department and told them.
The police quickly track Jones down and bring him in for questioning.
There were several polygraph exams given during Deborah's murder investigation, and everyone passed except for one particular individual who had solicited a relationship with Deborah. When he failed the polygraph, there was a lot of focus that was shifted towards him as well.
With Bernie's help, it seems the police finally have a genuine suspect in hand. Now, they just need to get him to talk.
Well, the investigators attempted to interview him several times.
With each interrogation, police crank up the pressure. Hour after hour, they press him for details about how he killed Debra Shepherd. But just when they think they're about to get a confession, Derek Jones stops talking altogether.
He became frustrated and finally stopped his cooperation.
Without any direct evidence connecting him to Deborah's murder, the police can't hold Jones any longer. And Bernie Shepherd is forced to watch as the man he believes to be responsible for his daughter's death is set free.
Then the next question, obviously, is where do we go from here?
Debra Shepherd was sexually assaulted and murdered just days before she was to graduate from college. From the outset, Deborah's father Bernie has been determined to find his daughter's killer. But now the chief suspect, Derek Jones, has been set free, and neither Bernie nor the police are any closer to solving the brutal crime. Then, after 25 years of marriage, Bernie's personal quest for justice begins to take its toll on his wife, Hazel.
He was just different.
I lost a lot of interest in doing a lot of things that I normally would have been interested in doing.
We were fighting, and we finally realized why we were fighting.
The drain on our relationship was becoming too great.
It was very difficult. I didn't know how we would make it through it.
In many cases, you find situations like this where families break up.
Months go by without a word from the police, and Bernie and Hazel begin to wonder if their daughter's murder case has slipped through the cracks.
Now, after a while, we got no further calls from Carbondale at all.
Then, when the family least expects it, Deborah's case begins to heat up after Carbondale police officer Paul Eccles gets a promotion.
In 1986, I was selected as the department's new crime scene specialist. I decided that it was time to read some of the old unresolved murders in Carbondale.
As Eccles is scanning the long list of cases, he comes across the Shepherd file.
I found an article that showed a picture of Mr. Shepherd, he holding a picture of Deborah. This man who sent his daughter to go to college, and on the eve of her graduation, her life was taken. And I too had a daughter.
Bernie Shepherd's fight to find his daughter's killer makes a deep impression on Detective Eccles. And now that he's in a position to do something about it, Eccles vows to take a second look at the case. But wary of raising expectations, he decides not to notify the Shepherds.
You don't call families and tell them what you're doing unless it's productive.
Remembering Bernie's suspicion that some clue must have been left at the crime scene, Eccles' first step is to reopen the boxes of evidence.
I honestly believe that the key to unlocking this mystery would be in the evidence.
Eccles finds the crime scene photographs, forensic files, a bath towel, and a purple shirt. Slowly, he begins to assess each piece of the puzzle.
DNA was the new science, the new technology, and databases were being built with known sex offenders.
Excited by the advances in DNA technology, Eccles re-examines the physical evidence that was gathered at the crime scene back in 1982. To his disappointment, the results are once again inconclusive. He still can't get a decent DNA profile, but the detective doesn't give up hope. Over the next 10 years, he continues to test the samples, hoping for a solid profile of the killer.
As the DNA technologies improved, I began to have contact with Suzanne Kidd. Suzanne was trained in DNA.
So Eccles just approached me so that we could look at the evidence in this case and see if we could take those DNA advancements and apply it to this case.
As his next move, Detective Eccles decides to revisit a piece of evidence from the scene that investigators had discounted years ago.
In 1982, there was no biological material found on the shirt other than some blood stains that belonged to Deborah. So that shirt was felt to have really been of no value.
But this time, Eccles urges Kidd to look beyond the obvious bloodstains.
She found a very minuscule stain away from the blood.
Kidd soon determines that it's not a blood stain at all, but rather the killer's semen. The initial sample taken from the body was inadequate for analysis, but Suzanne runs the shirt through a new specialized DNA test and puts the evidence in the National DNA Database. As the machine runs through the thousands of samples, Eccles and Kidd desperately hope for a match.
At that point, it was one of those things you kind of hold your breath, you say a little prayer and hope that this is the key.
For years, Bernie and Hazel Shepherd had thought that the 1982 murder of their daughter Deborah would never be solved. But now, Detective Paul Eccles and forensic specialist Suzanne Kidd have discovered a previously unnoticed DNA sample, and they're running it through a network of criminal databases, praying for a match.
The evidence was brought in July of '07, and then the DNA match was made in August. And from that hit, I was able to get a name of a person.
On August 13, 2007, Detective Eccles receives the name of the man whose DNA was found on Deborah's shirt, Tim Kreitcher. It's a stunning revelation. Both the police and the Shepherds have always believed that Deborah's killer was a college-aged African-American man, an old boyfriend, or a classmate.
I just couldn't believe our suspect was a white male and that he was born in 1944.
A quick check also shows that Kreitcher was on the same campus as Deborah at the time of her murder. In fact, He was taking classes mandated by the court in response to a previous sexual assault conviction. Fortunately, it doesn't take long for Paul Eccles to track down Kreitcher, who is serving time for an unrelated crime in an Illinois prison.
Having a DNA report and presenting that to Tim Kreitcher, he was very smart. He recognized that the only option for him was to plead guilty.
With the confession on tape, Eccles walks out of prison and places an immediate call to Bernie Shepherd.
That was the first positive information I'd had on Deborah's death since 1982.
I was very surprised. It was an older man and a Caucasian.
Mr. Shepherd wanted to know what happened. How did his daughter meet her death? I gave it to him step by step.
It was the night of April 8th, 1982, and Debra Shepherd was getting ready to graduate from college.
The person came by and saw her go into the shower. He had seen her through a window.
He broke into her apartment to rape her.
Came into the bedroom window.
With the door being found open and the note on the door, they had believed that no one came through that window.
The man attacked her when she came out of the shower into the living room.
Half naked, Deborah fights to keep Tim Kreitcher away from her. And in the midst of the struggle, she pulls off a bandana that's covering his face. But she's no match for the bigger, stronger Kreitcher, and ultimately, he strangles Deborah to death.
He says that the only reason he killed her was the fact that she had pulled down a blue bandana that he had wore to disguise himself.
My position is very simple. I want the man dead.
My husband and I think differently about sentencing. I've forgiven the man. I really wanted him to be punished for what he's done. I prayed for him.
On December 10th, 2007, Kreitcher pleads guilty to the murder of Debra Shepherd. He is sentenced to 40 years in prison, the maximum sentence in 1982. But that's not the end of it. Once Deborah's case is officially closed, Eccles makes a shocking statement.
Tim Kreitcher confessed to 9 murders, but it all started with Deborah's case.
Oh, that was really scary. Being a serial killer was very scary.
As a result of the investigation, 9 unsolved murders were finally closed, and dozens of family members brought a measure of peace. But what started it all was one father who refused to give up.
I have a lot of admiration for Mr. Shepherd.
And I'm so happy that with what my husband did, it brought closure for a lot of people.
Some people think that the deceased won't rest until the perpetrator is found.
My husband has never given up. That's one of the reasons I call him my hero.
While one father's enduring love inspired a decades-long crusade for justice, a best friend's devotion drives a missing persons case to a shocking conclusion. It's July 1st, 1996. A muggy summer night in Hanover, Maryland. Nancy Riggins kisses her young daughter goodnight and heads off to bed.
Amanda was such a joy to Nancy. She was just the apple of Nancy's eye.
Nancy Riggins' husband, Steve, who's just finished working a night shift, pulls into the driveway of the home he shares with Nancy and their 5-year-old daughter, Amanda.
He came home from work, noted that his wife's minivan was in the driveway.
Steve calls out for Nancy, but when there's no answer, he immediately realizes that something is very wrong. His heart racing, Steve can't get to Amanda's room fast enough. To his relief, he finds her still in bed, fast asleep. But after a thorough search of the house, Nancy is nowhere to be found. His first call is to his wife's best friend and co-worker, Tina Leischer. If anyone knows where Nancy is, it's Tina.
Stephen had called me the morning that Nancy didn't show up for work.
Tina is worried and urges Steve to call the police.
When Steve called 911, he reported that all of Nancy's belongings were inside the house, probably most importantly, her 5-year-old daughter. And there was no sign of Nancy anywhere.
Following the standard procedure, Greg Marshall, a detective with the Howard County Police Department, files a missing persons report.
We look at all the facts and we determine whether any follow-up information or any follow-up investigation is needed.
An investigation begins immediately as detectives talk to everyone who knows Nancy Riggins.
It was a matter of a lot of interviewing, a lot of knocking on doors, a lot of telephone calls.
But we had no leads.
We were gonna find leads. That's how it made me feel. She was worth looking for.
Tina and Nancy have been friends for 9 years, both cashiers at a local supermarket. They share not only their jobs, but their lives.
Nancy was always there for me. We talked about different things and issues in our lives, and we had a lot of fun together at work and outside of work.
The rest of Nancy's life seemed to revolve around her husband and daughter. And even though she worked days and Steve nights, by all accounts, it was a happy marriage.
You're set, Nancy. You got everything you ever could imagine.
I didn't need anything.
The one thing that none of her friends or family can fathom is what would compel Nancy to leave her 5-year-old daughter alone in the middle of the night.
She would have never, ever walked out that door without that child. It's impossible. I knew something awful had happened. It was time to act from day one. We all got flyers made up and went to different places. We plastered Nancy's face everywhere we could.
We passed them out at intersections near her home, at all the homes in her neighborhood, all the parking lots.
Days turn into weeks, and there's still no sign of Nancy. Meanwhile, Steve begins to fall apart under the strain. They'd been married for 8 years, and now he can't seem to function without her. Eventually, it becomes obvious that he's also having trouble caring for their only daughter.
I talked to him in lengthy detail why it would be a good thing for her to go with Nancy's parents while this was going on.
Eventually, my parents took her to Newcastle, Pennsylvania.
Tina's relieved to see Amanda in more secure hands. But Nancy's disappearance remains puzzling, and as the official missing persons investigation begins to falter, Nancy's friends redouble their own efforts.
No matter how long it takes, we're going to find her. And that's just the way it was.
Then in October of 1996, Tina and Laura decide to try a radical new approach. They contact a famous cold case psychic who agrees to help them for a fee. But it's more than either can afford on their salaries at the supermarket, so they set out to raise the funds.
At the registers, we would have containers with Nancy's picture. Everyone loved Nancy. The customers knew Nancy so well, so it wasn't hard to raise money, really.
When they approach the local police chief, he's skeptical, but agrees to let his detectives talk to the psychic.
She talked to the police officer because they didn't want us to give any information to her or slip up or say something that would, mislead her.
The psychic tells the detectives where to look for Nancy, and they in turn inform Tina and Laura.
There was going to be railroad tracks nearby. There would be no hunting signs, no trespassing sign.
The psychic's clues are too vague for the police to act on. Her description covers literally hundreds of miles in every direction. But with little else to go on, Tina and Laura start canvassing the surrounding area.
Every day, Laura and I were out in the woods searching for her every day.
Tina and I tried to incorporate different things that the psychic put in the reading.
Then, one cold morning in March of 1997, Tina and Laura happen upon a site that seems to fit the psychic's reading to a T.
I felt that she was out there.
And it isn't long before they come across a clue that appears to confirm their worst fears.
Laura literally almost threw up. She was so upset by it.
For over 4 weeks, Nancy Lee Riggins has been missing with no explanation. Her husband is shut down emotionally, and her parents are caring for their granddaughter. But her 2 closest friends are determined to find her, and now they believe that they may have discovered a clue in the woods.
We saw an actual bone. You know, we were frightened. I thought it was her. I really did, and I really thought we had found her.
But after a cursory examination, the police quickly determined that the bone could not have belonged to Nancy.
It turned out that it was an animal bone.
It did freak us out, but once you get past those initial things, you're over it. You can go on. Keep looking. You're not so scared anymore.
Then, just when the investigation seems to have come to a standstill, there's a break in the case that threatens to change everything.
The police called us and told us that Steve had sold Nancy's minivan.
He told the buyer Nancy just went away and that she had been talking about going away for a period of time and that she had just finally done it.
For months, Steve has maintained that his wife's disappearance was a complete surprise to him. Now, suddenly, he has changed his story.
That was very suspicious. Very suspicious.
The news from the police hits Nancy's friends and family hard.
Why would he sell the minivan? That certainly was an indication that Nancy wasn't coming back.
But there's one very troubling question. No one can figure out why Steve would want to harm his wife and the mother of their daughter.
We decided to go back and interview Steve.
He came to the police station voluntarily without an attorney.
But when cops confront him, Steve denies he ever told the buyer that Nancy was planning to leave. Still, despite scant evidence and no apparent motive, Detective Jacobs isn't buying it.
My gut feeling was that he was definitely lying about the disappearance of his wife.
Steve Riggins is now the primary suspect in his wife's disappearance. Nancy's family and friends are disturbed to think that the man Nancy lived with and loved could be her killer.
I guess it was just something that was trying to save my brain from thinking the worst.
Over the next few months, police continue to work the case and even search the nearby woods with cadaver dogs for any sign of Nancy.
We conducted multiple searches over multiple weeks.
With search dogs for many, many hours, days after days.
When we would go on dog searches with them, we would just hope and pray for the best that one of them would find a hit in the area somewhere.
Here's 2 civilians that were that driven and motivated to help find their friend and loved one. That definitely motivated me to not give up.
But as the months roll by with no sign of Nancy, everyone begins to lose hope.
That was very frustrating for all of us. We never knew where Nancy was. I mean, sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and think, where is she? And it's just a panic feeling. A family does need that part resolved because there's always an emptiness there.
Although under suspicion, Steve seems to get on with his life. He soon cuts off all ties with his in-laws. Either he's innocent and outraged or faking it. But Nancy's friends and family are becoming increasingly convinced that Steve was somehow involved in his wife's disappearance.
I knew for sure that he did something to her.
And when police suggest that a billboard should be put up near Steve's house, they all jump at the chance to help.
When he would drive to work, he would have to literally drive past this billboard.
The billboard had a huge picture of Nancy on it. Steve couldn't miss it.
Often, if someone goes missing, you'll at least get one call from someone saying they saw the person. And ironically, we did not receive one call from any citizen.
I think my biggest fear was that he wouldn't be caught.
Then, when the family thinks it can't get any worse, the police drop another bombshell. It turns out that Steve has a secret that he's been keeping from everyone.
We discovered in the course of our investigation that Steve was having a long-term sexual relationship with his babysitter.
It's been almost a year since Nancy Riggins mysteriously disappeared from her home, leaving her 5-year-old daughter behind. The primary suspect is Nancy's husband, Steve, but so far, there's been no physical evidence and no motive. Then, the police uncover a secret that turns the case on its head. Steve has been having an affair with his babysitter.
The babysitter at the time of this case was 18 years old, but we had determined that Steve had had a 4-year sexual relationship with the babysitter leading up to Nancy's disappearance.
I was just appalled that a man of 34 years of age would want to have an affair with a 14-year-old. I mean, that's just disgusting.
Even more shocking is what the police learn next.
We determined that Steve had actually proposed marriage to the babysitter and had actually given her Nancy's engagement ring.
It literally made me sick to my stomach.
Steve is arrested in February 1997 for sexual child abuse. He pleads guilty and is sentenced to 18 months in the Howard County Detention Center.
I thought this is a good opportunity to get him in jail and to get him lowered down a few pegs, and maybe that will make him break.
More importantly for police, the nagging question of a possible motive appears to have finally been answered.
We felt by then that the motive for Nancy being missing or being perhaps murdered was, in fact, the relationship that Steve had with the babysitter.
But there's still no physical evidence to link Steve to Nancy's disappearance, and that continues to dog the prosecutor's efforts to file charges.
At that time, we found no physical evidence whatsoever. No body fluid, no blood.
It was very frustrating. I thought, don't they want justice?
Still, spurred on by the determination of Nancy's friends and family, the investigative team refuses to give up. Over the next several years, they continue to gather circumstantial evidence and build their case against Steve.
You have to prove that there's no other reason for this person's absence other than the fact that they're murdered. We conducted dozens and dozens of searches, to include the use of dogs, to include the use of helicopters, to include the use of computer searches, passport searches. We did everything we could to try to close the door on any kind of possible defense that he might have at trial, and we were successful. I believe Steve murdered Nancy.
Finally, on September 21, 2000, the police arrest Steve Riggins for the murder of his wife, Nancy.
We were all overjoyed when he was arrested.
We were elated. We were finally getting some headway.
The trial begins on July 2, 2001 and lasts 19 days. And despite the absence of a body, the jury takes just 2 hours to deliberate.
There's just no other conclusion to draw other than the fact that she'd been murdered. They returned a unanimous verdict of guilty of first-degree murder.
It was an overwhelming feeling. It's just like, God, all the exhaustion, all the hard work, it's all paid off. Stephen is where he belongs, and I think that's justice in capital letters.
But the victory is bittersweet for all those who love Nancy. Steve continues to claim he's innocent, and the family still has no idea where Nancy's body is.
There was a piece of the case that wasn't solved. There was not closure because Nancy was still out there.
Even though Steve's in jail, Nancy's still missing.
After so many years, the case has become intensely personal for detectives Marshall and Jacobs.
I was determined to find out where she was.
From the moment that Steve enters prison, the detectives begin scheduling regular interviews in an effort to persuade him to reveal where Nancy is buried. But time after time, Jacobs and Marshall hit a brick wall. Then, one seemingly ordinary afternoon, 6 years after his initial sentencing, Steve Riggins finally gives in.
He knew he was up for parole, and it would help him if he would tell the police where Nancy was and we could find her remains.
On October 11, 2007, Steve directs the detectives to a wooded area 3 miles from the home he shared with his wife and child.
Can you, for the record, just pinpoint where exactly, what parameters, what area she might be in here?
In that fallen tree right there, the fallen tree right here. Right there.
Okay.
He pointed out maybe a 30 by 60 yard area where he buried the body. By 3 p.m., we found the human remains at that particular location where Steve took us along with a blue tarp.
In an odd twist of fate, the body is discovered very close to where Tina and Laura found the animal bone so many years before.
Laura and I were like probably maybe 20 feet away from it.
DNA testing confirms that the skeleton wrapped in the blue tarp is Nancy Riggins.
When they did find Nancy, for the first time since Nancy's been missing, there was peace in my heart.
But Steve provides only vague details about the crime. The police can only speculate about what happened that fateful night in 1996.
It would have been Monday, July 1st, 1996. She had an argument with Steve the day before on Sunday about the relationship with the babysitter.
I think it was premeditated. He intentionally planned on to kill his wife. I don't think it was an accident.
Steve went in the house. He confronted Nancy. He killed her by strangulation. He moved her body to the garage and put her in the minivan with a blue tarp.
He then drove Nancy, who is now still in the minivan, drove her to the wooded area.
Steve Riggins then proceeds to bury his wife of 8 years.
No one deserves that. Least of all, Nancy didn't deserve that.
Today, Steve Riggins is in the Maryland House of Corrections. He must serve 15 years before he's eligible for parole in 2016.
Steve Riggins will never get out of prison as long as I'm alive.
One of Nancy's sisters now has guardianship of Amanda, who calls her mom.